sorry, Lauren. May I switch up my...
Sure.
Thank you. No, take care of that. I can record you just a second.
Yes, you may.
I'm sorry, the defense would call John Donnelly, Your Honor. Thank you for consideration.
I swear and affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
You may proceed. I'm
Thank you,
sorry.
Your Honor. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Just fine.
State your name, please,
John Donnelly.
and your occupation.
I'm a retired physician's assistant. Now I do litigation support for attorneys and law firms and medical malpractice.
Okay. Tell me what a physician's assistant does.
Physician assistant basically augments a physician's services in MD. I was trained in trauma surgery and internal medicine.
How long had you been a PA? That's the normal term, or is that PA?
Yes,
Physician's assistant?
since 1973.
Okay. Can we use that term as we go forward, a PA, and we know
Yes, sir.
what we're talking about? Great. Since 1973? And when you say that you trained in trauma, what do you mean by that?
Major trauma, auto accidents, gunshots, stabbings. It's at Emory University in Atlanta, and I trained mainly at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta.
And you know George Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
And how do you know him?
George Zimmerman is a friend of mine. I've known him since about 2002, 2003. He's just a very good friend of mine.
We have just heard from your wife, obviously, probably passed in the hallway. So I'm going to abbreviate some of your testimony in that regard, but the jury, just a bit about your friendship with both George Zimmerman and his wife, Shelley Zimmerman.
We met George. My wife is a real estate broker, and she owns her own business, and we had an office in a building, kind of a one-story ranch-type building, Lake Mary Boulevard, and the insurance company was in one side, and her real estate office was in the other side. I have my own business, and my wife had an extra room in there, so my office was right next to hers, and we get along pretty well, so that worked out very well for us. And we have worked right next to each other for 15 years now.
Okay. Would you? Sure. Would you just give us a feel for how the friendship between yourself and Mr. Zimmerman and or his wife has grown over the past several years?
Our friendship really started with George oftentimes coming to our offices. We always had refrigerators full of sodas and food and microwaves. George took care of a lot of our insurance policies. All of our policies are with the insurance company. George helped us out a lot with that. We just got to be good friends with George. He was just a very smart, sharp young guy, and he'd just stop in, especially a lot of times after work, where we'd be there till 7 o'clock or so, and George would come in and sit and talk with us, especially about business stuff. He was very interested in business and starting his own business and how we were doing. And we just got to be very close to him. One time he came in and asked me to show him how to tie a Windsor knot in a tie. And that just touched a very little personal part of my heart, and he's always been there ever since.
So we credit you for the tie he's wearing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Matter of fact, we can probably credit you for more than just the tie, I understand. Is that correct? Did you help him with some clothing to get ready for his trial?
Yes, sir. I took George down, and I believe I bought him
And
3
I'm
suits.
Sorry, let me interrupt you because I didn't tell you as well. We're very used to talking in familiar terms with our friends, George, Mark, whatever. In courtroom, we need to use full surnames so that not only the record is clear, but the formality of the courtroom. So I apologize for not mentioning that to you earlier, but
Yes, sir.
when you mention George, please tell us his full name, okay?
Yes, I took Mr. Zimmerman down to a clothing store, and I purchased him suits, ties, shirts for a courtroom. I've been in and out of courtrooms many times, not testifying, which can be a terrifying experience. But I've been taught by my attorney clients that when you come to a courtroom, you dress out of respect for the
And that
process.
was one of the, sorry, that was one of the ways you supported him, helping him out with some clothing?
Yes, sir.
You've also donated money to his legal defense fund, have you?
Yes, sir.
And you consider him a friend.
Very close friend.
Have you tell the jury sort of the spectrum of voice that you've heard about George, from conversational tones to yelling or whatever you have as your sort of experience level for his voice?
Yes, I have a very close experience level with his voice, both in casual conversation, laughing, lunches, dinners. We were in several political campaigns for which my feet still hurt. And George and I would be holding up signs and yelling and so forth during the campaigns.
Okay. You had not listened to what we now call the Lauer 911 call until recently, is that correct?
Yes.
Before you studied to become a PA, had you had any medical experience before that?
I was a combat medic in Vietnam.
Explain what that is.
You're rendering medical aid to your men that are hurt, injured.
So go through, if you would, and apologize to the extent we're bringing you back to that, but with that as a premise, if you would explain to the jury what a normal day is in the life of a combat medic in Vietnam.
Well, if everybody will give me a little patience here. When you're in the Army, you're with 60, 100 men. You eat, sleep, shower with them on a daily basis. Oftentimes you're sharing your bunks with them. I got in Vietnam in December of '67, and through December.
I apologize, sir. I'm going to object as to relevance.
Please approach.
Mr. John, we were talking about your experience as a medic in Vietnam. I think you were saying that you'd gotten there in 1967?
I got there in December of 1967 through
And how
December
long were you there?
to December of 1968.
So approximately a full year.
Yes, sir.
And were you there as a medic the entire time?
Yes, sir.
So you were telling us that you basically are, how many medics are there available for these 60 to 100 men in the group that you were telling us about?
There could be 2 to 4 based on what the mission was for that day. Generally, you try to have at least 2 available for a full company of men, which could vary from 40 to 60 depending upon availability.
Okay. And then the medics are responsible, obviously, for the medical care for the combat troops?
Yes, sir, for the men who get wounded and hit.
Now, when we talk, is company the right term? You know, there's troops and companies and battalions.
Companies, well, there's squad, company, platoons. Basically, you might be in a squad search and destroy. You might be a full platoon search and destroy. You might be in a full company.
Okay. The 60 to the 100 combat soldiers that you were working with, can we come up with a term so that we know what we're talking about? Can we call that the company?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So even though it might not be precisely accurate according to the U.S. Army, for our purposes, we'll call that group of combat, and it was men back then in the 60s, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's call them combat men of that company. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you, maybe 1 to 3 other medics were responsible for the medical care of that company?
Yes, sir.
These were these people that you would be with throughout the day and throughout the week and the month and the year?
You're with them through the day, through the night. You're with them at all times.
Have an opportunity to talk to them and interact with them?
Yes, sir. When you were back at base camp, that's all you did was really take care of your equipment and talk and, you know, the scuttlebutt that goes on in the military, mess halls and so forth. You talk all day long because there's really nothing else to do.
Until the combat begins?
Until you get sent out on a mission, yes, sir.
During those times and with all of those men in the company, did you have an opportunity to talk to them both conversationally and what other form of communication? Yelling, screaming, laughing, anything like that?
Well, obviously the casual conversations, laughing, joking, sometimes drunken after 90-degree beers. But once you got into combat, then of course the voices change.
So you had a chance, and I know the timing isn't going to be right, but you would interact with the soldiers during the day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Presuming that the missions were at night, and I know that wasn't always true, but for our purposes, hanging out with them during the day, missions might occur at night, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you then have an opportunity where you would have to, when do you do your work? What happens that causes you to now have to be a medic and do something?
Well, at base camp, you took care of the normal routine medical issues that come up from colds or people, lacerations or anything else that happens. Once you're in the field, and once you get into combat, and in 1968, I think everybody remembers it was the Tet Offensive. It started the end of that January, and you could be fighting in the field for 5-10 days straight.
Did you then have an opportunity as a medic to have to attend to people that you knew during the day as they were wounded in combat?
Yes.
And tell the jury about that.
Yeah, it's a little difficult.
Well, I was just going to sort of see if I could lead
understand that
him.
there's been a request to approach the bench. I don't know what it's about.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
Please approach.
talking to you about your opportunity to interact with the soldiers on a daily basis, and then sometimes having to go out to deal with them after being wounded in combat. With that as a premise, tell me about, you would be called out to do what?
In the midst of combat, there are a lot of people yelling, screaming. Sometimes they're yelling, barking out orders. Other times they're yelling for ammo. Sometimes they're yelling for a medic. And sometimes they're screaming for help.
Okay. And based upon the year that you spent doing that, were you able to distinguish the yelling for help or the asking for a medic and compare that to those people that you had heard the day or the day of or the day before in regular conversational tone?
When you're in a combat situation like that, in the den of battle, for some reason you develop, I'm not sure what you would call it, an ability, but when you hear that, you can distinguish the screams for help, distinguish the screams for a medic. You grab your rifle, you grab your medic's kit. Your job is to run. You go to where they're at, but invariably, because you know the men you're with, you know the men that you eat, sleep with, you know who it's going to be before you get there.
And you can tell that from hearing their voice screaming for help and comparing that to what you heard in your everyday life with them?
Yes.
Okay. I had started this a moment ago by talking to you about the evidence in this case and whether or not you had listened to the phone call, the 911 call in this case. Had you listened to it, or when was the first time that you listened to it?
I had
Mr. John, we were
heard
talking
pieces
about
of
your
it
experience
inadvertently,
as a medic in Vietnam.
listening
I
to
think
the
you were
news,
saying that you'd gotten
and I
there in
generally tuned it
1960.
out. It can be very distressing.
To listen to a friend of yours scream for help, if in fact it was a friend of yours?
Yes,
And is that why you didn't listen to the tape?
that's why.
But you have listened to it recently, is that correct?
I listened to it on this past Saturday morning, sitting in my office alone, and I found it on the internet somewhere, and I played it exactly twice.
I'm going to play it for you again, if I might. This is the tape that is in evidence. I'm not sure if you listened to on the internet, but I'm going to ask if you would listen to this. I'm going to play it one time through to the end of the tape. And then if you want me to play it again, let me know. If you want me to go back to a certain point, let me know. At the end of which I'm going to ask if you have an opinion concerning who you hear on the tape, okay?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, I'm talking about not the person who's speaking to the 911 operator, but the noise in the background, okay?
Maybe both. I'm not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
1211 Twin Trees Lane.
Twin Trees Lane? Is this in the Twin Lake Homes in Sanford?
Yes.
Okay, and is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick, please.
Okay. Does he look hurt to you?
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
All right, what is your phone number?
Is that the tape, or very similar to the tape that you've listened to last week?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you have an opinion as to whose voice that is screaming in the background?
Yes, sir.
Based upon your knowledge of your conversation with George Zimmerman and the life experience that you've now brought to the jury, whose voice do you believe that to be screaming for help?
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that is George Zimmerman. And I wish to God I did not have that ability to understand that.
I think very well.
Mr. Donnelly, you recall, I took a deposition of you back, I believe it was May 9th, maybe, of this year, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that about right?
Yes, sir.
I think your wife was first, or maybe you were first and then your wife, you recall
Oh,
that?
my wife was first.
As it should be, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then we took yours and it was very brief, correct?
Yes, sir.
You never mentioned anything about testifying, about identifying the voice, or did you?
I don't believe I did, sir. I don't believe it was asked. As I recall, everybody was hungry.
Okay. So you think it was just short, or you didn't mention anything about that? Didn't I ask you what you were going to be testifying about?
I don't remember being asked if I was going to testify about it. At the time, well, through this whole thing, I really didn't want anything to do with the tape.
Right, okay, so what you're saying is, after the deposition on May 9th, 2013, you said it was last Saturday that you, on purpose, listened to the tape, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and Your Honor, I have address that after we finish. So you, after the deposition and between, literally last Saturday, so we talking about like on the, I guess today's the 8th, so we're talking about the 6th is when you listened to the recording?
Yes, sir. It was Saturday morning.
And I apologize, we're talking about last Saturday, literally.
This last Saturday,
All right.
just
And-
a couple of
and-
days ago.
Right, because my recollection is in the deposition, you had not listened to the recording or really were going to testify about it, correct?
I may have heard parts of it, but I generally try to, I always tuned it out. I walked away from it.
On
It
purpose,
was-
I think you said,
On
correct?
purpose. It was very distressing.
Sure, and so what you did is, 2 days ago, you on purpose listened to it to see whether you could identify the voice so you'd be able to testify in court, correct?
I listened to it very purposely in a very quiet setting because I think I just needed to before I came here today.
All right, and I think you said you listened to it twice.
Yes,
Did I
sir.
understand you correctly? Now, if I may, why did you have to listen to it twice if you, at the first time, knew it was George Zimmerman's voice?
I don't know. I just played it a second time.
Just to verify it in your mind that you would be sure that you could come to court and say, absolutely?
No, it was just an emotional
Okay.
experience for me, and I
Okay,
don't even know why I played it twice, but I did.
okay. And I gather you made sure you were in a room setting where nobody else was present, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe your wife already testified, and obviously you weren't in the courtroom when she testified. My question is, prior to listening to that tape on Saturday, had you discussed it with your wife at all, in terms of whether she had listened to the tape at all? And I'm not saying that was improper, I'm just saying, do you recall?
Not really. We've never really tried to discuss much of anything
Okay,
with this.
all right. She mentioned, or I know when we took your deposition, you had mentioned that you had given money before to the defense fund.
Yes, sir, I have.
And I think it was $2,500 at that time, correct?
I gave a check for $2,500 for his defense, and then I gave $500 to his personal website.
Right, so that was $3,000, and then after that, you bought him suits?
Yes, sir.
Okay, do you recall how much approximately money?
About $1,700.
Okay, and then that includes ties and shirts and all that other stuff that you were asking?
Yes, sir, they were on sale.
Okay. Was that a Joseph Banks? Do you want to plug wherever you bought it? No. Did you get a good deal on those, I gather is what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you testified because you've come to court before, people need to appear a certain way in court properly, et cetera, correct?
Yes, sir. It shows respect for the system.
Yes, yes, sir. And so you would agree that there's a bias there on your behalf of George Zimmerman, correct, because of your friendship?
He is my very dear friend.
Yes,
I
sir.
think
Yes,
of him
sir.
as a son.
All right. And in other words, you contributed money to help his cause, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then you also, as you mentioned, of clothing, et cetera.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So is that it in terms of total? So that was, you said $3,000 and then about $1,700, so that's about $4,700, give or take a little?
Yes, sir. Other than taking food
Right.
to his home.
Yes,
for
sir.
him.
Other than that, I'm talking about monetarily or?
Monetarily, that is it, sir.
Okay, all right. And then, did you listen to any other recordings? Specifically, the recording where George Zimmerman is speaking to the 911 non-emergency operator?
I believe I heard part of that on the news.
Okay. Was that about the same time, or was that recently, or back in February or March or April of last year?
That was a ways back because we've tried not to watch anything.
On purpose? Is that correct?
Yes.
I know you're nodding your head, and so I knew the answer was yes, but
Yes, sir, and
we
I
just
know-
need for the record, I know these jurors can see.
I know better, too.
Okay, all right. And so you have heard parts of the non-emergency, only snippets that you think, or?
Probably snippets. I really
Okay.
try not to pay too
Sure.
much.
Okay. And those snippets, do you recall what was said in the parts you heard on the news?
Not really, sir.
Okay. Let me do, if I want to do is, I'm going to play a recording for you if I could.
Yes, sir.
And for the record, that state's exhibit. What number is it? 173.
Sanford Police Department, line being reported to Sean.
Hey, we've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. It's Retrieview Circle. The best address I can give you is 111. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining, and he's just walking around looking about.
Okay, and this guy, is he white block?
Do you recognize the voice?
Yes, sir.
Or one of the two voices, right?
Yes, sir.
And one of them is George Zimmerman, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
First Bennett,
He looks black.
did you see what he was wearing?
Yeah, a dark hoodie, like a gray hoodie, and either jeans or sweatpants and white tennis shoes. He's here now. He was just staring,
Oh, he's just walking around the
looking
area.
at all the houses.
Okay.
Now, so far, is that just a normal conversation you would have heard on a regular basis with Mr. Zimmerman, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And now he's just staring at me.
Okay, and so it's 1111 retrieve you or 111?
That's the clubhouse.
That's the clubhouse. Do you know what he's near the clubhouse right now?
Yeah, now he's coming towards me.
Okay.
He's got his hand in his waistband. And he's a black male.
Okay. How old would you say he
He's got
was?
a button on his shirt. Late teens.
Late teens, okay.
Mm-hmm. Something's wrong with him. Yep. He's coming to check me out. He's got something in his hands. I don't know what his deal is.
Okay, just let me know if he does
Get him
anything,
off the
okay?
over here.
Yeah, we got him on the way. Just let me know if this guy does anything else.
Okay. These assholes, they always get away.
Did you hear that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Said something, oh God, these assholes, they always get away. Did you hear that language? You want me to play it back, or?
Your Honor, I would object as a mischaracterization of the evidence. He added words that didn't exist on the tape.
Sustained, if you want to.
Do you want me to play it back for you? Oh, can I?
they always get away.
Did you hear that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would you agree that based on your experience and his voice, he's a little more excited than previously?
No, sir.
You think he's just the same monotone?
Everybody has different tones to the
Okay.
voice as they're speaking, much
Right.
like I am now, but
Right.
he's speaking to law enforcement and he's trying to give them information.
Okay. And so you had not heard that before?
I hadn't heard that part before, no.
Okay. And I don't need to play the whole thing. You heard another part dealing with where he uses the words, other derogatory words. You had not heard that before?
I may have heard snippets of it, sir, but I'm hearing everything pretty much fully today.
Okay. So you were trying to become familiar with his voice, I guess. You were already familiar with his voice, but you were trying to compare it to just the 911 recording on Saturday?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you didn't go back and listen to any other recordings?
No.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get. You didn't compare it to any other voices that he had made prior calls or anything like that?
No, sir, I didn't need to.
Okay, because you already knew his voice?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Now, on that recording that you listened to, the 911 operator, I'm sorry, they're calling it the Lauer, the one that Mr. O'Mara played for you, I'm not going to play it again. You know which one I'm talking about? The one
Yes,
that you
sir.
listened Saturday, I apologize.
Yes, sir.
Okay. It was similar to the one that was played in court, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you heard the person you believe is George Zimmerman yelling, "Help, help, help," continuously, correct?
That was absolutely George Zimmerman.
Right? And he was yelling, no doubt in your mind, you believe it's George Zimmerman.
There's not a single doubt in my mind, sir.
Okay, all right. And he was yelling over and over, "Help, help, help," correct?
Yes, and I heard there's like other screams, help, but the screams in particular, I could tell, I knew that was George Zimmerman.
So you heard other screams too?
There was help, there was some other ones. Those particular emotional, obviously, when someone is in dire straits, whether it be in combat or anything else, your voice obviously changes. I've heard a 250-pound man, sound like a little girl
Right.
screaming, but before you get there, you know who he is.
Right, so you believe there was some that were definitely George Zimmerman, and others you heard you couldn't make out who it was? Did I understand you correctly?
The voices I heard screaming and for help were George Zimmerman. There
All
were
of
other
them?
voices up on top of that. In the tape, there's 911 operator, there's other stuff, which oddly enough I'm familiar with, because in the din of battle you have a lot of extraneous other noises going on at the same time.
Other
But
people
as-
yelling or other people, whatever, speaking?
Other people yelling. At the same time, you've got small arms fire, you may have mortars, rockets, you've got people screaming, but you still have the ability to pick out the ones that you have to run to as a medic.
The ones that you're familiar with, in other words, the other people, if you weren't familiar, if some guy had shown up that day in the company and you had never heard his voice, you wouldn't be able to pick out his voice as easily as the person you're familiar with, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Yeah.
The voices that, of course, we've been together, most of us, for a period of months, and we all knew
Right.
each other's voice and who it was.
My question is, if there had been a person that had just shown up that day and God forbid there was a firefight out there and there was a shooting or whatever, you would not have been able, if you had never heard his voice, you wouldn't be able to pick out that person's voice.
No, sir. After
Right.
that February, we had a lot of new guys.
Right, okay. And in this case, the only voice you're able to pick out is George Zimmerman's voice, correct?
The voice screaming on the tape is absolutely George Zimmerman, sir.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor. I just have a matter to bring up to the court, and we can do it. I don't know if there's...
Shall we finish the examination?
I didn't know if it had to do with before that or not, so,
I think we can do it right after, but...
okay, any redirect?
Please, Your Honor. Just to clear, as you listen to the 911 tape, I thought you were saying that some of the screams were...
Objection as to leading?
just
Sustained.
when you listened to the 911 tape, were all of these screams that you heard, those that said help and those that were just screaming, was that all from George Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
Then there were other voices like the 911 operator, Ms. Lauer, and others. But the background noise, was it one person or was it more than one person in the background?
That was one person. It was easy for me, just based on my past experiences, very easy for me. That was George Zimmerman.
Okay. And did you ever discuss with your wife this non-emergency?
No, sir.
You had listened to this tape on Saturday, 2 days ago?
Yes, sir.
When did you contact me?
I believe I called you Saturday afternoon.
Right after you had done this?
Yes, sir.
Was that the first time they were talked about your testifying regarding the 911 call at all?
Yes, sir.
Was that a difficult decision for you to make?
Extremely.
Was it an emotional conversation that you and I had regarding having to deal with this issue?
Yes, sir.
Are you coloring or changing your testimony at all simply to help Mr. Zimmerman in what you might perceive to be a time of need?
Not at all, sir. This courtroom is about truth. At some point in time, even though this is personally very hard for me, this is the place truth is supposed to come out.
Is that why you decided to deal with whatever demons existed from 45 years ago and still testify concerning this event and those events here today?
Yes.
Nothing further on.
Whose idea was it to listen to the recording Saturday?
It was my own, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
May Mr. Donnelly be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, sir. You are excused. Counsel, approach the bench.
We call Doris Singleton, Your Honor.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm sorry?
I said, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank
Great.
you.
And I guess you were just sworn back in, but you've testified here before the jury before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me focus you, after you had a conversation where you took an initial statement from Mr. Zimmerman. We talked about that in your initial testimony, correct?
We did.
And then you were also present with Chief Investigator Serino when he was doing some of his workup, including a second statement taken from my client. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. I was there.
Okay. Was there a time that you were present where Investigator Serino was meeting with Tracy Martin?
Yes, I was there when he was meeting with Tracy Martin.
If you would, tell the jury the circumstances surrounding that.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This calls for hearsay, and we can approach the bench for
Yes, you may approach.
Singleton, we were at the point, I think, where you were telling us about an event with Officer Serino and Tracy Martin. Remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. I think the last question was, can you tell us sort of the setting, sort of give us an outlay of how things were when you were there?
Okay, I believe it was 2 days after the incident that Trayvon was shot, and Tracy Martin was there to speak to Chris Serino, and he was concerned that arrest hadn't been made, and Chris Serino was trying to explain to him the circumstances of the way.
Your Honor, I would not be offering Officer Serino's statements as, for the truth of the matter, sort of rather laying out the foundation. I think that's an exception to the hearsay rule. I'm not going to get into what I'm speaking, and I apologize.
Okay, she could testify as to what she had observed and what the circumstances were, but not as to what anybody said.
You're approved,
Not as to what anybody said?
including the other officer? Because if then I would need to be heard at the bench for that, Your Honor. I know the limitation we talked about already, just not that one.
Well, go ahead and ask your question, and I'll wait for an objection.
Okay, thank you. I think you were saying then sort of the setting, so if you would continue.
Okay, the setting was in the office cubicles at one, and it was sitting, they were both sitting at Chris Serino's desk, Chris in his own seat, in an extra chair that had been brought over to Chris's desk so that Tracy Martin could sit. I believe it was his girlfriend that was with him. And they were there so that Chris Serino could explain to them why, at this point, an arrest couldn't be made.
And it was your understanding that Investigator Serino was still in the beginning stages of the investigation, is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was either 2 or 3 days after the incident.
And where were you sitting or standing while this conversation was occurring?
I was sitting probably diagonal to the cubicles. The cubicles are set in a square, and there's a path between them that you can walk through, and then there's a hall. And I was basically in the hall. It's not really a hall, but it's where the cubicles would end before there's another wall that actually has offices that are walled. So I was probably about 8 or 10 feet from his desk.
Okay. And did there come a time then that Investigator Serino played what we now know to be the Lauer 911 call for Mr. Tracy Martin and his girlfriend to listen to?
Yes, he played it for them.
And do you recall if it was played once or more than once?
I recall it was played once. I'm not sure if it was played more than that.
And without telling us the verbal response, what did Mr. Martin do in response to listening to the call?
Fair objection, Your Honor. Calls for reversal.
Well, she could describe what she saw, but not what she heard.
You understand hearsay, right? And what you can and can't say. So I'm not asking you to tell us what Mr. Martin said, but I am asking you to give an observation as to his physical response.
He was very upset. He was very sad. He hung his head, he cried.
And did he give a response to Officer Serino?
Yes.
The next question I think might be objectionable for record purposes, Your Honor. What did Mr. Martin say in response to the question by Mr. Serino as to whether or not that was his son's voice?
Fair objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And no further questions for this witness right now, Your Honor, though. State may have some.
Okay, Officer Serino, can we get him in court, please?
Would you raise your right hand? You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Of course, you testified here before the jury before today, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're placed back under oath, so your testimony will be as well, testimony under oath. We had begun a conversation with your last testimony that talked about the ongoing investigation that you were in charge of regarding this case. You were the chief investigating officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time that you met with Tracy Martin and his girlfriend, Brandy Green, in your office?
Yes, sir, there was.
Do you recall about how many days after the event of the shooting that was?
It was either the day after or the day after the walkthrough. I think it was on the 28th.
Okay. What was the purpose of you bringing Mr. Martin and Miss Green to your office?
To bring him up to speed as far as the progress of the investigation and where we were at that point.
Okay. They had some concerns, did they not, as to whether or not Mrs. Zimmerman at that point had been arrested?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And were you sharing with them your progress and what was done and what still needed to be done?
Yes, sir.
And can you outline the setting, where you were when you had this conversation with the two of them?
We conducted a meeting in the conference room that we have in the police department on the second floor. And and after that, I went ahead and played the 911 recordings for him.
Okay, do you recall where that playing of that recording took place?
It was at my desk.
Okay, and that was, as testified to by a previous officer, sort of a cubby hole set up with 2 or 3 other desks in a close proximity?
Yes, sir.
And can you then tell the jury how that was set up, where you were sitting, where Mr. Martin was sitting if he was, and where Ms. Green was sitting?
Okay, I was seated in front of my desk facing my computer monitor. Mr. Martin was to my rear left, and next to him was his girlfriend or fiance, Brandy, and kind of like in that posture.
Okay, so if I'm sitting at my screen right here, you were sitting down?
Yes, sir.
Tracy Martin then was just over your left shoulder?
Yes, sir.
And then Brandy Green just behind or next to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what was the focus at that point?
The audio portions of the recording that was playing on my computer.
Okay. We know, and I want to focus you on what we have shorthand called the Lauer 911 call. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes, sir.
And that is the call that has the screams on it and the gunshot?
Yes, sir.
And did you play that for Mr. Martin and Ms. Green?
Yes, sir. I played all the recordings for him.
Okay. Focusing on the 911 call, we just talked about the Lauer 911 call. Tell me how you played that, what volume, or how the setting of that occurred.
I can't recall the number as far as the volume went, but it was audible, relatively clear, as clear as I had. It was played off of I believe off of a CD. It might have been digital or an email. Don't quite remember, but it was played and it was audible.
Okay. And what was Mr. Martin's response?
Emotional, understandably so, and I let him listen first.
I'm sorry?
I let him listen first before I asked anything.
Okay. And what did you ask him?
I believe my words were, is that your son's voice in the background? Or something. I think I said a little differently than that, but I inquired as if that was, in fact, his son yelling for help.
And what was his response?
It was more of a verbal and nonverbal. He looked away and under his breath, as I interpreted, said no.
Did he ever ask that the tape be played for him again that time?
I don't believe so.
Did he ever evidence to you any concern with being able to hear the tape?
No, sir.
Had that occurred, would you have simply played the tape for him a second time?
Absolutely, sir.
And Miss Green, what was her response?
She was consoling him. I didn't hear a response from her.
Did you ask her specifically whether or not she believed it to be Trayvon Martin's voice?
No, sir, I did not.
Did she offer any opinion voluntarily as to whether or not she believed it was Trayvon Martin's voice?
None that I recall, no, sir.
Do you know who else was present in the area sort of nearby, within, let's say, earshot of the playing of the call?
One of our sergeants was behind us. He was walking through. I guess he saw what I was doing. and he took it upon himself to stop, and I believe that was the only person that I saw.
Do you recall what that sergeant's name was?
Sergeant Leon Ciesla.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Cross.
Talk about the last thing you mentioned. Sergeant Ciesla was walking by, or you believe stopped, is that correct?
Yeah, no, he stopped, yes.
Okay, and Detective or Investigator Singleton wasn't around as best you can recall, is that correct?
No, sir.
She was not, correct?
No, I didn't see her there.
Okay. Now, I assume by the nature of your profession that this is one of the most difficult things you have to do,
By far, sir, yes, it is.
to have to talk about the death of a loved one to a parent.
Yes, sir, it was.
Is there anything more difficult that you have to deal with as an investigator in a case involving the death of a person?
Other than an initial notification, probably not.
And I gather you try to, as best you can, to be as sensitive as you can, realizing how sensitive this issue is, or how traumatic an event it can be, correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you attempt to do that as best you could?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. I gather you informed Trayvon Martin's dad that you were going to have him listen to some recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you tell him ahead of time that there would actually be a shot? In other words, that he would actually listen to the death of his son, in other words. Did you tell him ahead of time?
I don't recall specifically informing him of that, no.
Okay. But you played, I think you said 5 or 6 911 calls, is that correct?
Every one that I had, yes, sir.
Okay. And at this time, do you recall the order or how you played them, other than you played them all?
I don't recall the order, but yes, I played them all.
And would you agree that some of those recordings, such as Ms. Serdika's, was gut-wrenching, in other words, for a parent to have to listen to when they're talking about the death of their son?
Yes, sir.
Okay, they were pretty emotional.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that Mr. Martin's reaction was appropriate in the sense of having to relive that, even though he wasn't there, but having to, again, understand that his son was no longer among us? In other words, that his son was dead in heaven, hopefully.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and would you agree that he reacted appropriately to that?
Yes, sir.
So you played the recording in which Ms. Serdika is, and the jury's listening to him, so I'm not going to play it again, but she's describing the death of this kid, or describing what she heard, whatever it was. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you're playing other recordings in which other people are describing what they saw, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather as you're playing this, Mr. Martin's getting very emotional. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Was he having a hard time dealing with this?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he didn't say, hey, hold on, this is too difficult for me. Let me come back another day. He went ahead and said, I'm going to listen to everything, because he wanted to know what was going on in the case. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And from your perspective, that was very understandable, correct?
Absolutely, yes,
I
sir.
mean, his son has been killed, 2 days earlier, correct?
Sir, yes.
And he's wanting some answers, as any parent should want. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't that reasonable on his part?
Yes, sir, it was.
That next thing he knows, he gets home and his son's is missing, and then he realizes his son's dead.
Yes, sir.
And it's not just from natural causes. Somebody has shot him in the chest.
Let me object, Your Honor, outside the scope of direct examination.
I don't know, I think this is pertinent to the issue that I'm trying to establish, the scenario that Mr.
Well, then get
Martin.
to your next question, please.
Yes. In other words, did you preface any of this? I know this is going to be very difficult for you, but please try to listen to all these recordings. I'm assuming you did that, because you're a police officer's been around the block a lot of times.
I believe I did, yes, sir.
Okay. And he, even though realizing it was going to be emotional, said, I'll try to listen through this and try to go through it?
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And as he's listening through this, is the emotion kind of building up? Do you see that building up?
It was a very emotional moment, yes, sir.
Okay. And then you played, at some point, the recording of the screams for help, correct?
Yes, sir, I did, yes.
But also in that recording, there's actually a gunshot, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And I gather you played, as a good investigator, you played all the recordings from beginning to end, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that there would be no issue about what was going on, that you actually were thorough in your attempting to tell Mr. Martin what had happened.
My objective was to share all the information I had with him.
Okay. So you were providing all those recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he's listening to these cries and then he hears the gunshot, correct? And then
Yes,
you
sir.
keep playing it, right?
Yes, sir.
And I guess it was obvious in the way you were playing it that we were talking about his son having been shot.
Correct.
I mean,
Yes, sir.
was there any dispute about that?
No, sir, there was not.
That he understood that that was the death of his son?
Yes, sir.
And I gather you being as sensitive as you can based on these circumstances. Well, I'm assuming it was emotional for you too.
It was trying for me, yes, it was.
Okay. And obviously being a good investigator, police officer, having done this for a long time, you were trying to be as sensitive as you could in dealing with the death of a young boy that the father was there, in other words.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then at some point you had to ask him some questions about the identification of the boys, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you, as best as you could, even though you knew Mr. Martin was upset and emotional, that you still felt you had a need to ask him at that point, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you asked him something to the effect that you recognized the voice, or do I have it right, or am I misstating what you said?
It was either do you recognize the voice or is that your son's voice in the background?
Okay. And as this was going on, when you specifically asked him that, I think you described Mr. Martin that his head was down, correct?
It was more like looking away from me and the computer.
Like he didn't even want to deal with it. Is
Yes,
that how
sir.
you interpreted it?
Yes, sir.
And then you stated that it was under his breath, I gather, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
And you interpreted it as he said no, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you didn't flat out hear the word no unequivocally, or did you hear it like something under his breath and he was distraught?
I heard it and saw the movement of his mouth.
Okay, so you believe, your opinion is that he said no?
Yes, sir, it
Okay.
is.
Now, do you know if that no was directed to the fact that you had just played literally not a videotape of his son's death, but an audio tape, or was it related to the identification of the voice? Do you know?
We had checked, Your Honor, that would be speculation of this witness.
Sustained.
Would you agree that when you asked him that, that was after you had played the recording in which you were asking him to identify the voice, but in that same recording, he was hearing for the first time, right, the death of his son,
Yes, sir.
right? As
Yes.
far as you know, he had never heard this shooting before in terms of his son being killed.
Yes, this was prior before it was released, so it had to have been the first time.
Okay. If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
And sir, I gather in all your years of doing this, when people are hearing about the death of a loved one, even when you go like to the door, when you go to their house or something, most people, they react like, oh no, like, my God, something's happened, their son or loved one is no longer among that. Is that a normal thing that people, or do people just react, oh, okay, no big deal?
It's extreme grief, so yes, that is typical.
And the word no is like, I can't believe it, like he's dead. Isn't that a normal
Your Honor,
thing?
that would be speculation.
It's based upon what his experience has been, so in that regard, I'll allow it.
Right? It's normal for, when you're telling them about the death of a loved one, people say, no, I can't believe it, that kind of stuff.
It could be construed as denial.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Like, and that would be a normal thing based on your experience when people say no, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Thank you. Redirect?
Yes, please. During all of the 911 calls, you played all those 911 calls, correct? But
Yes,
it
sir.
was only after, and specifically after you played the Lauer 911 call, that you looked at Mr. Martin and asked if that was the voice of his son screaming in the background, correct?
It was the most graphic, yes, sir.
Right, and it was right at that precise time because you wanted to know what he thought of the voice on the tape, didn't you?
Objection, leading question.
What was the purpose of asking him?
To clarify that it was, in fact, if it was or if it wasn't his son's voice.
Right, because that was significant to your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir.
You were doing it, as Mr. DeLeonda said, as sensitively as you could, but it was something you had to do as the chief investigator.
Yes, sir.
Because you knew that if Trayvon Martin's father had said it,
Objection,
what
that's a leading question.
Okay, you need to rephrase your question.
was it significant in your investigation that Mr. Martin said it was not the voice of his son?
It became significant in the investigation because at that point in time, there really wasn't much of a dispute at that time of where that voice came from.
Because it was your understanding in your investigation that other information, well, let me ask you this. What other information supported that was George Zimmerman screaming?
Objection is to hearsay now.
Only to the extent that he was the chief investigating officer, Your Honor, and he...
No speaking objections,
Sorry.
please. Overruled.
It was statements that I obtained from the initial responding officers, coupled with statements provided by an eyewitness. You want names or?
Sure.
Okay, Officer Tim Smith, statements that he had heard the defendant make, and John Good, who at that point had provided me with the statement, both in writing and I believe taped also, that it was his belief that it was George Zimmerman the one yelling for help.
So, with that information in mind, you were presenting this to Mr. Martin with what idea? What did you want to accomplish by presenting this to Mr. Martin and having him listen to it?
For my own clarification, to make sure that everybody had it correct, or at that point, information that I had was correct.
And did Mr. Martin's response fit into the other information you already had available?
At that point in time, yes, sir, it did.
And to the extent that he said no, you understood that to be what? When he said no, what question do you think he was answering?
That the voice in the background was not that of his son's.
Did he ever contact you in the days or weeks after that to ask you whether or not he could listen to the tape again?
No, sir, he did not.
Did he ever say anything to you about, I want to change my mind and I want to listen to it again to see anything else about that tape?
No, sir.
Did you question directly Ms. Green in regard to her thought as to whose voice that was?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did she counter or contest Tracy Martin's acknowledgement that it was not his son's voice?
Objection calls for hearsay and also an assumption on the part of Ms. Green.
I'll rephrase it.
That the objection sustained.
Did Ms. Green counter, did she say anything that evidenced to you as the investigator that she disagreed with Mr. Martin?
No, sir.
Though it was undoubtedly a very emotional time for Mr. Martin and also for you, do you have any concern that he understood your question and that he answered it by saying no?
No, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You were asked about information you had prior to that,
Yes, sir.
and you mentioned Mr. Good, correct? You
Yes, sir.
mentioned Mr. Good and you mentioned the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
I didn't mention Mr. Zimmerman. That was independent of Mr. Zimmerman.
Okay, you mentioned Tim Smith,
Yes, sir.
that he had actually heard the call, or he just said this is what Mr. Zimmerman said?
Yes.
Okay, right?
Yes, based on what Mr. Zimmerman said to Officer Smith.
Right, and you recall when you played that recording to Mr. Zimmerman, that Mr. Zimmerman said, it doesn't sound like me. You recall that?
Yes, I did.
In terms of you played that 911 call and he told you, it doesn't sound like me, correct?
I believe his words were, that doesn't even sound like me, quote unquote.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And finally, sir, you were asked about Ms. Green who you knew as the fiancee or girlfriend of Mr. Martin, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that she was consoling Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of what she said, she heard or not, she was focusing on providing whatever comfort she could
Yes, sir.
to the father of the father of Trayvon Martin.
Yes, sir.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, I gather in all your experience, you've never had a recording such as this where you don't just have a voice, but you also have the shooting itself all in one recording, or have you had that before?
No, this is the first.
That's the first time?
Yes, sir.
So it was pretty emotionally draining for you two, I'm assuming, having to play that for the victim's dad.
That and the circumstances surrounding the entire incident. Yes, sir.
There's not really a SOP or any kind of written directive in the police logbook or whatever, or case book on how to deal with things like this, is there?
Other than calling for spiritual assistance and support, but at that point in time, that interview or that debriefing or that briefing of the family, there is no that I'm aware of.
And I gather in the reaction of Mr. Martin, you kind of sensed what he was going through too.
Oh, yes, sir.
Was it obvious?
Very much so.
Thank you, sir.
Do you redirect?
Only on the one issue that was just brought up. When Mr. Zimmerman said to you in the challenge interview that you had with him, doesn't even sound like me, remember that, just brought up by Mr. Del Riondo?
Yes, sir.
You did not take that as an indication that Mr. Zimmerman was denying that it was him on The Voice, did
Objection,
you?
leading question.
Sustained.
Did you, when Mr. Zimmerman said that to you, what indication did that give to you?
As typical as somebody hearing their voice on recording, a lot of people don't recognize their own voices. It's a little bit different hearing it than how it sounds when you're speaking it.
Within the context of your investigation, did you accept that to be a denial by Mr. Zimmerman that it was actually his voice?
No,
Or
sir.
just that he didn't recognize his own voice?
I didn't take it as a denial, and I took it as him not recognizing his own voice.
Okay. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. May Officer Serino be excused?
At this time, subject to recall.
Okay, you're excused, but subject to being